Brad Johnson, welcome back to America Daily. We always enjoy having you here at America Daily with all of your insights and analysis based on your experience as a former CIA operations officer. And today you're going to give us your analysis on where the facts tend to lead on John Brennan's involvement to help the Democratic National Party rather than leading the CIA to ensure the security of America. So, Brad, why don't you give us your take on that?
All right, super. Thank you for having me again, and just kind of stepping back and doing just a overall analysis of how we end up where we are. There's a couple of questions that need to be answered, and one of the things that's really glaring that rarely gets talked about is the origin of this whole thing. This Spygate, the case that the Democrats tried to create against Trump. Now, it's a very interesting aspect because a lot of these things occurred before we knew who was even going to be the candidate of the Republican Party for the last election that Trump then won and ended up becoming president. So a lot of these things were set in motion before. So how does that come to be? That means that those things weren't targeting Trump specifically. They were maybe being kind of set up to target whoever the Republican candidate was, but not Trump specifically. So I find that actually one of the most revealing and fascinating aspects of this whole case. So how did it come to be? Now, there are many that theorize that the origin of this, I mean, big names like Rush Limbaugh and others have talked about how the WikiLeaks appears to be the origin of this whole Spygate problem. And it actually makes tremendous sense. I think that analysis is correct because if you look at it, Hillary Clinton had a real problem once the WikiLeaks emails were out there, because those were of classified documents. Later, a big batch of those were also captured and brought to light on the Anthony Weiner laptop, where there were thousands of classified documents. So now we know, even out of what James Comey said, that the origin of those classified documents that were sent around as emails were including things like from the CIA, certainly from State Department and so on. As Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton had access to basically everything within the CIA, everything at the FBI, not on specific legal cases out there, but from an intelligence perspective. So she's the lead, the senior cabinet position, so would have had access to all of those things, including specifics on CIA cases and intelligence operations, the origin of where information came from that they were using. So that's the type of information that would have been probably included in those WikiLeaks things that are there. And a lot of that thing would have been very dangerous for Hillary Clinton. And if you look at some of the other facts, the whole Chinese CIA operations that were being run in China against China for the CIA, those guys were all wrapped up and shot. Same thing, a couple of guys got wrapped up and shot in Iran during that same period where Hillary was using this unsecured system. Now, we know from Texas Congressman Louis Gohmert that the people that actually hacked that server were the Chinese, not the Russians. So again, they would have known that going into this too. So why pick the Russians? Well, because it wasn't the Chinese. Those Chinese got shot. So I mean, that's one of those things that actually fits all the facts. So if that is indeed the case, which it really appears to be, there's very strong evidence that it was the case, Hillary Clinton had a problem. And so she had to look around and find a solution. And because of the international nature of this, because of the intelligence involved with all of this, there was only one natural person for her to turn to, and that was John Brennan. Now, John Brennan was then the director of the CIA, and he had come up in the system as essentially an apparatchik. Now, he did join the agency as an analyst in the director of analysis, but then was moved to the Hill and started doing political things fairly on. Didn't really succeed at the CIA, so basically got farmed out to the Hill. And from there, then he retired and ended up coming back and was picked up by a guy named George Tenet. Now, George Tenet was a previous director of the CIA under Clinton and for a time Bush, but he was the same thing. He was a Hill staffer, that kind of person. He was a bureaucrat, an apparatchik. So he recognized by this time the same thing in John Brennan, who was his chief of staff. Then John Brennan later came back to be director of the CIA after all of that. So that was where John Brennan really came from, and that was at essence what he was was a Democratic Party apparatchik, using the Russian term for bureaucrat. And that was just how he thought. Those were the people he knew. That's how he ran things. So Hillary Clinton would have turned logically to John Brennan to fix all of this. So as we start going through Spygate and as the elements start popping up, there's always a common theme to them. And that common theme is John Brennan. Now, because of the international nature, it makes sense, but there's also so many of them. And if you take a look at, just take a look at the origin of the Steele dossier. Comes out of England. Supposedly this former contact of British intelligence puts this dossier together. He had gone to some Russian oligarch. This just recently came out in the news. Paid that guy. This guy then goes around to the former KGB guys. They put together the dossier, and that's what it is. And so then he had kind of a fig leaf where he could say, well, this is what they told me, and passes it back to the political system here in the United States where it gets passed around. So at the time all of that was done, where this was all being originated, that was done when John Brennan was the director of the CIA. Now, very unlikely that all of this could have been done and would have been organized coming out of British intelligence without him being involved in knowing. And if you look, he publicly was making trips to that area at the time. And also, kind of a little side note, the current director of the CIA, Gina Haspel, was none other than the chief of station in London at the time, a close associate of John Brennan. So interesting little tidbit there. But if you look at some of the other things, now some of this is coming out because of an unrelated case, but there is the case of Sabrina D'Souza, who was a CIA officer who was involved in a rendition case. It was an Egyptian terrorist who was taken off the streets of Italy and sent back to Egypt. They didn't have sufficient evidence to prove him guilty of terrorism, so he was eventually let go. Comes back to Italy. We'd had a change of government, and so they indicted a bunch of people. Out of all of those indictments, everybody was set free. They were released from the indictments, except for one person, and that was this Sabrina D'Souza. Sabrina D'Souza had there was conflict between her and John Brennan. Brennan, for whatever reason, and I don't have the details of what specifically went wrong between them, but he disliked her. So interestingly, he was making trips to both Portugal on her case, and this is where these details are starting to surface because her case is still winding its way through the European court system because she was indicted in Europe, and also to Italy. So as we see these people, some of the people that were used to try and entrap Carter Page, how Papadopoulos was basically, his girlfriend was pitched and he was approached trying to get information on him, culpable information, trying to make him look guilty. All of that was organized through the Italian service and the British service. And during that same period, like I said, we are getting a lot of information on John Brennan's travel there. Well, why would he travel so often to go to Italy? I mean, there can be other reasons, but also these could be reasons. And the same thing to Portugal. He didn't have a particular reason to go there, but those are the two trips he was making. Now, as everyone knows, and it was heavily reported, though the 6 of the most senior intelligence officers in Italy were fired after one phone call by Trump to the Prime Minister of Italy. Well, okay, now I don't know what President Trump said, but he said enough to get those 6 people fired. So and that was a ways back. So that means all this information has been bubbling up. And today now we have Attorney General Barr digging into all of this stuff. People are starting to run scared. And now what we're hearing is a lot of the people who've already testified on the Hill are making corrections to their testimony. Okay, well, what's that mean? So that means they came in previously testified. They weren't under any threat, any legal threat. So they said whatever they wanted to say. Now Attorney General Barr is looking at it. Attorney General Barr can put those guys in jail for the rest of their lives. So they're taking a look at all of that going, well, I need to clarify and make perfectly clear what I previously testified to. So all of their testimony is starting to change and evolve. Now, these guys are faced with jail time. All these guys are going to sing. So I have full confidence this is going to start to come out. We also just saw another very interesting thing that, again, it leads back to John Brennan. Now, there was this group, a very friendly group of the Brits and the people in power there, and the American intelligence. And so again, where they would feel so comfortable, if all of this pans out, they would feel so comfortable to be able to go create the Steele dossier out of England, knowing that they could cover their tracks. And out of that same period of time, it's now surfaced that the British ambassador to the United States, Mr. Kim, I believe is his name, was reporting back to England that Trump is a nutcase. He's, his administration is in turmoil. Nothing is working right. And if you look back to what the original Democratic Party line was here in the United States at that time, it was all those same talking points. So the British ambassador was reporting back to London the Democratic talking points. Now, again, how do the economy has done wonders. It's growing great. We're at 3% growth, where under Obama it was barely reaching 1%. And he was talking to Larry Kudlow and people like that clearly understood the economy and knew how to make it grow. So how would you, and the British ambassador knows all that. He knows all those people and understands all of those things. So how would he conclude that this guy is nuts and isn't going to make the economy is going to be in shambles and blah, blah, blah? How would he conclude all of that? And it's based only on these talking points. So it just shows that there was that little cabal, if you will, that little group of people that were in that echo chamber all telling themselves these things. And I think that's why you saw the comfort level of probably John Brennan in the early planning stages putting all of this together, is because they had this group of like-minded people that would cooperate. And let's not forget that now, as these people start to argue among themselves and point the finger, we now see James Comey and John Brennan each pointing the finger at each other. Now, again, out of Congress, we've seen a couple of people who've had access to this stuff for a long time start to talk about what's in these emails that have been not released yet, but they're verbally saying what's in there. One of the items that came up is Comey was saying, oh, John Brennan insisted that the Steele dossier be used. And John Brennan was saying, no, it was James Comey. But now we know that there's an email that exists that we have not seen, where John Brennan is saying, no. You have to include the Steele document, because that's the crown document in this whole thing that makes everything else make sense. So, and translating, if you will, that is the analyst way of saying that if you remove that document, everything else falls apart. So you have to have that in there for everything else to make sense. So now, again, analyzing that, we know now that all of that was false. Everybody knew it was false all along. Everybody knew it was a paid-for political document. John Brennan knew all of that stuff, yet describes it as the crown document. Well, that means that he understood how this whole thing was put together and what the plan was. Comey did not. Clapper doesn't seem to have been the main player. So if it's not John Brennan, who is it? And there isn't any other likely candidate. There just isn't anybody else that was able to touch all of these different things, that was in all the right places, in touch with all the right people, that understood, had the wherewithal to try to put all of this together. Now, of course, all of this was predicated on Hillary Clinton winning, which everybody thought until 9 p.m. the night of the election, Hillary Clinton was going to win. She ended up getting beat, and beat solidly. And so I think everyone was stunned, including John Brennan. And if you, again, look, now this is just the operational assessment that you do of people, which in human operations, my background, you look at how people behave and what they do. And that's where you saw John Brennan, for example, who's an absolute political hack. On his Twitter feed, for example, his Twitter page, he says, nonpartisan. I don't think there's anybody in Washington who's more partisan than he is, but that's how he tries to play himself. And so he goes on an MSNBC and NPR, and that's where you see him get out there and just go nuts. I mean, his eyes bulge and his veins bulge and his face turns red, and he's filled with hate and rage at Donald Trump. Well, what's Donald Trump ever done to him? Why would there be all that rage and all that hate? And what makes sense in all of that is that he's trying to cover his own rear end. And he knows if this goes bad, that he's at the center of it. That would be a reasonable explanation of why he would have all this rage. Nothing else fits. You have a lot of other people out there that don't like Donald Trump. Donald Trump is for whatever good or bad, is a pretty polarizing guy. And so a lot of people are very critical of him, but you don't see them turn red and bulge and go crazy and spittle coming out as they yell on TV about how crazy Trump is and how much they hate him and all of that. But John Brennan does. And I think John Brennan has done all that because he's the guy with the most to lose. And now we've talked and kicked around, if all of that is true, if all of those details that make sense are in fact indicators of what really happened back there, and that Hillary Clinton had turned to John Brennan put this whole thing together to basically frame whoever won on the Republican Party side in order to cover up for Hillary Clinton. If that's true, the question is, does it rise to the level of treason? And, I think at some point as this went along, it probably did. I don't think it started out as treason per se, the political manipulations and so on, pointing fingers at each other and blaming that person. But once Trump won as president and they were still trying to falsify information about his campaign to try and associate him with the Russians to use as proof of guilt on President Trump cooperating with the Russians against the United States. I think once that was done, then it does in fact rise to the level of treason. And I hesitate to say it, and I don't like saying it, because I somebody that had a clearance for the United States of America and was supposedly working to protect us and our national security, I regret very deeply that somebody could fall so low to have been involved in those sorts of things. But like I say, there's just, what other alternative theory is there? And there isn't one that fits any of the facts, yet alone all of the facts. So it's the only thing that seems to be out there that's viable. And like I say, I fear that that's what John Brennan did, getting so caught up in his own political beliefs and his own political belief system and being a loyal party apparatchik, that he put party above country. And I fear that that's what happened, and I fear that he became a traitor to the United States of America at that point. And if that's the case, then he needs to pay the price for it. Whatever that price is, as it goes through the legal system, whatever it is, he needs to pay it. And if it were personally, I know this is probably a hardened thing to say, but if that were to include the death penalty, then so be it. I mean, if you're gonna do those sorts of things, you need to be willing to pay the ultimate price for it. And like I say, I fear that it might reach that level. It's not something I desire, but if it does, if it meets those thresholds, and if what he did was organize the whole thing, if he was the brains behind that, then there's a price for leadership too. So that whoever pays the biggest price would be the person that caused all that, be it Hillary or John Brennan or whoever it was. So I think that kind of lays out the whole, why all of this stuff makes sense, why it always kind of leads back to John Brennan. And again, he's the only one person could have pulled all those strings that way.
Well, once again, Brad, we thank you so much for your insights and your analysis on this. And hopefully our listeners got something from this and understand that this is a very serious thing, right? I mean, treason and being a traitor is a very serious thing for our country. And we thank you so much for your interest and your concern about the security of America. Thank you again.
Thank you for having me.